In this episode of Newscast, we're going to focus on the aftermath of that brutal knife attack that happened in Belfast on Monday night. What happened on Tuesday night was, well, it's been described as thuggery by lots of people. Very dramatic pictures of a bus and some people's houses being set on fire in the city. That led to lots of appeals for calm from across the political spectrum. And as we're recording this episode of Newscast on Wednesday tea time, we're waiting to see if there's a second night of disorder. But we will bring you up to date with everything we do know on this episode of Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and in terms of what we learnt today, a lot of it came from the first court appearance in this case. The accused person is a 30-year-old Sudanese man, now named as Hadi Al-Odeid. He was in court on Wednesday lunchtime. He appeared by video link, actually. He was charged with possession of a knife in a public place and also threatening to kill an NHS worker. We also learned in court that the victim is a man in his 40s called Stephen Ogilvy. He's still in hospital. He has lost his left eye as a result of this attack. He's got quite serious damage to his right eye, along with injuries to his neck and back. And Al-Odeid has been refused bail and he's remanded in custody, and we will next appear in court on the 8th of July, so in about 4 weeks' time. Separately, we got a statement from Stephen Ogilvy, the victim's family, on Wednesday afternoon. They said they want to make it absolutely clear that the unrest in Belfast on Tuesday night was not welcome. They said that peaceful protest is the only way forward. They also paid tribute to the many migrants who live in Northern Ireland and contribute to the country's healthcare system or the hospitality sector. And they said that Northern Ireland depends on those migrants being there. And they also paid tribute to the passers-by who intervened on Monday night, one of them with a hurling stick to try and stop this attack getting any worse. Stephen Ogilvy's family saying they're pretty sure their relative would have died if it hadn't been for the bravery of those bystanders, some of whom also filmed it, which is why so many people have seen what appeared to happen on that street in Belfast on Monday night. Right, let's talk about some of the implications and some of the aftermath of all of this. Although I say aftermath, I mean, it's still kind of unfolding as we're recording. But let's look at some of the issues that have been raised by this incident and the aftermath. Joining us down the line from Westminster, it's Chris. Hello, Chris.
Hello.
And we're joined by Ciarán Dunbar, who's presenter of the BelTel podcast, which is the podcast of the Belfast Telegraph. Hello, Ciarán.
Hello, Adam. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for coming on as our two podcasts merge. So, Ciarán, I mean, if we just rewind a little bit, as a Belfast resident, I mean, how did this story first start unfolding for you?
Well, just to be clear, I do present the BelTel podcast and I do work for the Belfast Telegraph in Belfast. I actually live myself slightly to the south of the city. So I don't actually live in the city, to be clear.
Okay, as somebody who spends a lot of time in Belfast then.
Well, I mean, I became aware of the knife incident on Tuesday morning, and and I know, we go into journalist mode, we go into podcast mode, and we put out the best podcast we could on the information that was available. We would have known from experience that there was a prospect of violence and protests and rioting because of that. We managed to get that podcast done, and using our journalist who had gone to the scene that night. I remained and worked till around 7 o'clock last night because I was covering a major court case we have here. And when I was driving out, I found myself confronted by a large crowd of, on one of the roads in North Belfast, black-clad men with their faces covered. And I looked at it, and then I realised there were other people fleeing towards me. And I recognised one of them as a photographer, Mal McCann, with the Irish News. He was running with his photography gear. Journalists were fleeing because they were being chased. And as I say, chased with menace by men, perhaps young people, I'm not sure, with their faces covered. There was a helicopter in the air. I believe people have seen this on other outlets. I can remember very well because I realised from experience I need to get out of here. And the car in front of me, listen, riots and these things, they're not for beginners. The car in front of me had frozen solid in the street, and I realised I just put my hand on my horn, and I suppose I may have said some expletives. Get out of the road. We need to get out of here. And then on to open, empty roads on one side, and on the other side, complete, a complete traffic jam. So that's when I was very aware that it was going to be a very hot night.
And then, Ciarán, we've been hearing all sorts of stories of people who were caught up in this, often in quite a scary way.
Yes. Now, the word has been used by nationalist politicians to describe what we saw. And it is a very loaded word everywhere. And it's a very loaded word in Northern Ireland because of our history. And that is the word pogrom. I believe when you look at the dictionary definition of the word pogrom, people attempting to remove a certain group of people without targeting any particular individual, and doing this on multiple occasions in the same place, I believe that's a pogrom. And I believe that we did see a small-scale pogrom in Belfast last night where groups of men, and I think this is the worst part of it, because yes, property was destroyed, of course it was, but we saw groups of young men, for the most part, banging on doors, checking for foreigners, as they said themselves, and telling them to get out. And in several stages, many houses actually, in fact, I'm not sure, I don't have the exact number, that houses were burned. We saw police officers and fire brigade staff rescuing people from those houses after they had been deliberately set on fire. So those were shocking incidents, and I think there's widespread shock, fear, and revulsion across the board. And one thing I have to say, from listening to people today, from talking to people today, the fear in Belfast, and it has been over the last 24 hours, not of migrants, not of asylum seekers, but of thugs on the street. That is not to say that there isn't a real fear after what happened on Monday night, and that is not to say there's not a real anger across the communities, across all communities in Belfast after what happened, but the fear has quickly switched to these marauding gangs.
That's the thing, isn't it, Ciarán, here? In that, anger, given what happened the other night, is understandable. But to hear you there describing the reality in your city last night, and the language that you've chosen to use to describe the scale of what we've seen, and then what that says about your fellow citizens, and what that says in terms of how people feel about their city is really quite something. When we see those images, when we see the at least the motivation of some of those involved.
Yes, and people were intimidated on social media before this. There was kind of an order went out, turn off your doorbell cameras, no filming. And some of the filming that we do see, we can hear people screaming, no, turn off that camera, no filming, we told you no filming. And journalists were intimidated from several sites, and journalists who'd come across from England as well were told to leave several areas. So this was not a protest, as in like a protest. If you have a protest, you tell the media. You want the media to see. You want to make a point. You have placards. You make yourself available. There was none of that. This was intended to happen behind closed doors. Now, that's not the way it works in the modern era because of mobile phones and because someone's always going to video something. But what happened was clearly it built up. There was a high degree of planning, and that level of violence and targeted violence spilled out onto the streets.
And as we're speaking now, Ciarán, and it's about 7:15 on Wednesday evening, you basically can't get a bus or a train in that area right now.
No, you can't get a bus or a train anywhere in Northern Ireland. I saw
the whole of Northern Ireland. Oh, I heard that there was a bit of a pause on public transport. I didn't realise it was the whole of Northern Ireland.
There has been no public transport since 5 o'clock today, and in actual fact, most of it shut down before that. I saw a story up on Twitter from a former BBC colleague of mine, a BBC colleague of yours, and he was saying that he met an elderly lady in Derry she was trying to get back to Newton Abbey near to Belfast, and she said, I just can't get home. What am I going to do? So, I mean, a lot of people are dependent on public transport, but the city of Belfast itself was emptied around lunchtime today. People were told to come home and to go home, and the shutters came down. So in a sense, Belfast is shut with all of the costs that come with that.
How much, Ciarán, has there been a conversation, a national conversation, a political conversation in Northern Ireland in recent years about the scale, significant or otherwise, of demographic change, of migrants from beyond Northern Ireland, beyond the island of Ireland, beyond the UK, perhaps beyond Europe, coming to Northern Ireland, and the extent to which there's been a conversation, a debate, any sense of anger about whether or not that's been, in any sense, too much or unmanageable?
Well, this debate has spilled over via social media, from Britain. It has come across the border via social media up from Dublin. It has come across from Europe also as well. And obviously it has come across from the United States of America. Now, with all due respect to Northern Ireland, it isn't the most attractive destination in the world. Our numbers, in terms of migration, there is no mass migration into Northern Ireland. Our numbers of minorities and migrants is very, very low. Let's be honest. Some people perceive there to be mass migration. The facts don't stand up to that. However, of course, certain minorities may be concentrated in certain areas, and that creates impressions in people's minds, as it does all over the world. In terms of the debate, I would say that it has not been mainstream. I haven't said that this is our third year of race-related riots. Certainly, parties on the unionist side have been more vocal about these things, more worried about these things, and more angry about these things. So there is that part of it. Now, I just don't believe that mainstream politicians perceive this to be the most important issue. Now, for the minority of people who are extremely animated about this, there is no issue more important than migration. And I suppose it's the same story everywhere. Now, one of the things we have to say is that yesterday, the five major parties here put out a joint statement. That was a very positive event in itself. One of the parties didn't join in that. That was the TUV, the Traditional Unionist Voice. They have condemned all violence. I have to say that very clearly. But there's always a however, a but. This wouldn't be happening. And the debate now has now seemed to focus, in their minds at least, and in some other unionists, on this border, the open border. But that open border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland is a vital part of the peace process. So, in a sense, we always return to Churchill's dreary steeples. It always comes back to us. It always comes back to that border issue.
And Chris, tonight the UK government is quite keen to emphasise that even though the border sort of doesn't really exist in law enforcement terms, there is law enforcement around people crossing that border and whether they've got the right to be in Northern Ireland or Ireland.
Yeah, and there's two thoughts I think that spring out from all of this. One of which, as you, Ciarán, were just mentioning, there is a strand of conversation we spent inordinate amounts of time talking about in the context of the Brexit debates, and then the other, if you like, sits in the context of the wider UK debate about migration and asylum seeking, which so often has as its visual backdrop small boats and the English Channel. And of course, the UK has a land border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and courtesy of the Good Friday Agreement and all of those conversations that followed around the Brexit debates, that is a border that, to all intents and purposes, is, you can cross without barely noticing you've crossed it. Clearly the roadsides change, etc., etc. But it isn't an international frontier of the type that you might imagine, for all the reasons we spent eons discussing on Brexitcast. So it raises questions, and it has raised questions. There's loads and loads of questions to the Prime Minister's team and the Downing Street team after Prime Minister's questions at lunchtime today around what's known as the common travel area, the capacity for people to travel between the Republic and the UK very easily, including from the Republic to the UK whilst you are still on the island of Ireland. In other words, driving, or in the case of this particular incident, getting on a bus and going from Dublin to Belfast. And certainly the government is making it clear as we record, having encountered a shed load of questions at lunchtime and not really offered much of an answer to many of them, of what they're doing around immigration enforcement, in particular in Northern Ireland. In fact, as I speak to you, I'm still reading this note, so I'll have a proper read of it fill you in a couple of minutes. But in essence, there is clearly right now a lot of scrutiny coming in the direction of the government in London around a border that is very easy to cross.
And it's interesting what you were saying, Ciarán, though, that unionist politicians are much more comfortable saying that border should maybe exist more than it does. And actually, we got an example of that today at Westminster, where the leader of the DUP at Westminster, Gavin Robinson, said this.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday I shared my concern that community cohesion stood on the precipice. The North Belfast attack on Monday was medieval. It was sadistic, and it's sadly been viewed by millions in this country. As reprehensible as it was, the outrageous violence, intimidation and community damage carried out last night in my constituency and in other parts of Northern Ireland require the strongest condemnation. It is impossible to share concerns about damage to our British values and then act in a way that tarnishes the very thing we should want to protect. The government's job, our collective job, is to act, to protect our country and to defend our borders. The Prime Minister knows that the man charged entered our country illegally. He passed through 2 safe countries and attained asylum in record time. Will he meet with me urgently to discuss the steps he and his government will take to ensure our values are enforced, that the rule of law in this country sustains, and that he protects and closes the open, porous border between our country and the Irish Republic?
And Ciarán, a few things for you there. Just the idea of closing the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, either partially or fully, that's just a non-starter, isn't it?
That's pie in the sky. I mean, it just can't happen for 2 reasons. I mean, politically, that would be the end of the peace process. Now, when I say the end of the peace process, I don't mean a return to widespread Republican violence. That's not what I mean. But it would end
the current settlement.
The current settlement, that would end. And also, we have to look at the practicality of it. You know, during the Troubles, there was 30,000 British troops and 20,000 RUC men of one description or another. There were watchtowers, there were helicopters, there were armoured cars. The bridges were blown up, and it didn't close the border. It's simply not possible. So I mean, so you have to put it like that. Now, yes, you could make it a lot more difficult. You could make it very challenging to people, but it is not realistic. Having said that. All of these incidents we've seen in recent days and hours have happened in loyalist areas. However, that is not to say that there isn't anti-immigrant feeling and concerns over immigration, if you want to put it like that, in nationalist areas too. Now, there are different political dynamics in that, but there does seem to be in a small minority perhaps a coming together in minds with the with loyalism between this sort of section of nationalist feelings, and we can get back to that.
In other words, there's been pictures of people going out and getting angry about this, and you can see Irish flags and British flags together, which you wouldn't normally see, basically.
Yes, and we saw protests in Dublin today also from people who would describe themselves as patriots. Now, many of those people may actually, you may find, may be very strongly in favour of partition. They may have taken that journey, and those people might say, well, there's illegal immigration coming into the Republic of Ireland from the UK, from Northern Ireland, and you might find that some of those people would also like to see this hard border, and never mind what Northern nationalists and people in the border areas think. I mean, we don't know what the future holds, but I do think, as we speak, I find it very unlikely that there'll be anything more than a symbolic hardening of the border.
And on exactly that point, just picking through what the folk in government here in London are saying around the questions that they're facing around the common travel area and the nature of the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. So they are saying the number of asylum seekers in supported accommodation in Northern Ireland has decreased by 6% under this government, from 2,500 in June of 2024 to 2,300 in March of this year. They then talk about something called Operation Combi, which they describe as a multi-agency crackdown targeting abuse of the common travel area, and then point to the arrests that have been made in the last couple of years, 250 organised criminals as they're described, and immigration offenders who they say have abused the common travel area. But that then gets to questions we don't have the answer to, but Ciarán, you were touching on there, which is on what basis did this individual get into the Republic of Ireland? Then once in the Republic of Ireland has managed to travel to Northern Ireland, and from that point on then sought asylum, was granted refugee status, and was given leave to remain until 2028, and we're told had not kind of crossed the desks of any authorities, not least the police, prior to earlier this week. So there's quite a lot of subtleties and details to unpick, either in this particular case, or indeed you might apply to anyone else, around their precise status in the various places, not least the Republic, that they, if you like, carried at the point that they were there, and therefore was there did they arrive illegally in the UK, albeit without ever encountering, because of the nature of the border, the kind of thing you would encounter if you were crossing the Channel, i.e. Border Force, or indeed if you arrived at an airport, i.e. Border Force, and then you go through the process of applying for asylum.
Yeah, what I'd like some clarity on is, does a person who arrives in the UK via the common travel area with Ireland, are they counted as an illegal arrival? Because they arrived onto UK soil, Northern Ireland, legally, because they crossed the border that doesn't exist. Where they're illegal, in my mind, would be arriving in Dublin. And as you said, Chris, we don't know anything about actually that border crossing.
And because so much of the UK political debate around illegal immigration and asylum seeking, and they're not always the same thing, of course, but is focused on the Channel and that desire, that law passed by the Conservatives to make that crossing illegal. Does the same thing apply if you have crossed a border that is effectively, for the sake of this conversation, sort of invisible, or doesn't involve, border force, and then you apply for asylum and you go through that asylum process in a conventional way? So, I mean, I think the fact that we're getting to some of this, we're asking these questions, and the government is attempting to offer answers, whilst a lot of the questions, by the way, they don't have answers to, like how many people do claim asylum in Northern Ireland having arrived from the Republic.
Yeah, because there's a category in the stats that includes people arriving from the common travel area, but also includes people from other routes too. And you can't disentangle the people who have crossed the border from Ireland from the other routes that are in that category, even though that's a separate category compared to small boats or people arriving at airports.
Quite. And given all of the things we've discussed on this episode and previous ones about why the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic is as it is, it seems likely, Ciarán, as you were saying, that there is a limited amount in practical terms that the UK government, or indeed the Irish government, would be able to do without changing that border to something that wouldn't be politically sustainable.
Well, I'm sure someone could think of something, I suppose, more cooperation, more cross-border cooperation. I'm sure the nationalist parties in the north that's the solution that they would like to put forward. I think it's very important to say, I mean, we know that this individual, this person who has been charged, arrived into Dublin Airport via Paris. So, I mean, he didn't get on the plane in Paris without a passport, etc., etc. We, just in case listeners mightn't realise, to my knowledge, we don't have any sort of small boat situation in Ireland. It is the journey would be simply too treacherous. Now, obviously, people will get into the state, into the Republic of Ireland, and into Northern Ireland by illicit means. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but it would be extremely difficult to do so because you're arriving by large ferries with ID checks, and by air as well. So that's a situation that which we wouldn't have in Ireland, and supporters of immigrants' rights would point that out, that they would say that in their view, because of that, then there is no one illegal in Ireland. Whereas to counter the rhetoric where people simply use the word illegal as not an adjective but a noun.
And Ciarán, just going back to what actually happened on the day itself on Monday night, the area of Belfast where it happened, I'm always very aware whenever I go to Belfast, every neighbourhood, every street sort of has a story or a backstory to it. Can you tell us a bit about the area where it happened and whether the geography has a part to play in all of this?
Yes, this area would be described as a working class area. It has also been described to me, it is relatively new. The majority of the people living there would be imagined as a nationalist Republican area in people's minds, in territorial minds, I suppose. Now, there are, as I said, it would be considered to have quite a transient population. And there were quite a few people who originated in other countries housed in that area, and other people, I suppose, who would not be normally considered to be permanent residents. So there are those issues. Now, there was a stabbing in the street in this area last year. I mean, this street would have its troubles, but it's off the Crumlin Road, which is just in North Belfast, adjacent to the Shankill Road. It would be very close to what we would call an interface, and that is basically a large wall dividing Protestant communities and Catholic communities, and this area would have been on the Catholic side of one of those barriers.
And are there other things going on beyond the kind of the usual community tensions in Northern Ireland and in Belfast that make this place stand out? I'm just thinking, is it a place where people really struggle to get on the housing ladder? Or is it where the cost of living is really, really biting?
I wouldn't say it stands out in terms of North Belfast. No, in terms of the cost of living, that's out with some very middle class areas. That's a near universal problem in Belfast. And yes, in terms of housing, there's a lot of pressure on housing, and North Belfast has been for a very long time. And when we talk about housing pressures, I talked about that barrier, I talked about that wall. You know, you need to build houses on both sides of the wall. Nationalist politicians would say that there's a more acute need on the nationalist side for housing, etc., etc. And whenever those barriers move, whenever new housing is developed, very, very quickly, perhaps flags will go up. That territory will be claimed. So. That's a point been made also in recent days, you know, that there are areas in which people from different countries live in Belfast, which people from a Catholic background couldn't live in. And obviously that may happen vice versa in terms of Protestants living in Catholic areas as well.
And then, Chris, just to end our conversation, how's this been playing out at Westminster today? Because obviously we had Prime Minister's questions because it's a Wednesday lunchtime, but it wasn't a sort of major feature of that.
No, it wasn't. We heard from the Prime Minister in front of the cameras for the first time, expressing, as you would expect, his horror at the events of both of the recent evenings, both the initial attack and then the sort of thuggery that followed after it. What the parallel I was just really struck by, Adam, with Prime Minister's questions today was how similar it was to a week ago in one sense, in that you had this huge issue dominating the news agenda, and the Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, judging that she would rather talk about something else. And she pursued a line of questioning about the defence investment plan and investment in the military and all the rest of it, which is entirely separate, very important, but entirely separate issue. And I think grounded, as it was a week ago when the swirl was all about Henry Novak and the incident in Southampton, both his murder and then also the protesting and all the rest of it that followed. I think a judgment from her that if you are going to make an argument that you don't want to be seen to be, as some would see it, politicising an issue, in this context where there's a live police investigation, in that one, given the amount of tension there was, but also the request of the family to not be seen to sort of politicise it. The only way to do that is to pursue a completely different line of questioning. Now, that's not to say it didn't feature. We heard from the DUP earlier on Newscast from Prime Minister's questions. The Liberal Democrat leader, Ed Davey, raised it as well. But yeah, I think a bit of a sense, even though there are clearly loads of wider political questions to ask around immigration, around integration, around the common travel area, etc., as we have discussed. Yeah, broadly speaking, it was touched on and brushed by, if you like, by the main the main party leaders, but wasn't dissected in any. The implications weren't really dissected in any great depth.
And in terms of Nigel Farage, how's he been handling this? Because if we're I know it's not linked to the Novak case because that's a different set of circumstances and a different set of arguments, but it is about an issue about kind of identity and race and security.
Yeah. So he wasn't. He's been in the Makerfield constituency on the by-election campaign trail. Richard Tice, his deputy, did ask a question at Prime Minister's questions. Strikingly, reform figures have explicitly and directly and immediately condemned violence and the kind of scenes that we have seen, whilst raising some of these wider issues. So they described recent Labour and Conservative immigration policy as treacherous, as they described it. So they are willing to lean into some of these wider themes that are undeniably live in the context of what we've seen this week, and indeed what we saw last week, for all of the differences that there clearly are between the two things. So yeah, it is a live question, and certainly speaking to lots of folk involved on different sides of the by-election tussle in the northwest of England, there is a keen awareness that all of this plays into those conversations, and conversations that Reform are sort of more willing to lean into than some others.
And Ciarán, I've been really struck listening to Chief Constable John Butcher, who's the boss of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, PSNI, doesn't mince his words on two things. One, the influence of social media. He says there's just loads of nonsense on social media, and he's sort of quite refreshingly honest about his view of like what's floating around in the social media ecosystem. And also he very weighing heavily on the kind of parental peer pressure of saying to families, you've got a job here tonight to stop your extended family going out and burning stuff down.
That's it. Behind those masks, many of those will be very young people, and if they get a criminal conviction, that will remain with them. But yes, he has been very vocal on the social media thing, and I've been on Twitter. I have been following this myself on Twitter, and Twitter still has its use. It's now known as X. It has its uses because of this. But I have my timeline, and has been flooded with material from people who I am not following. And I don't know if they are in Moscow, I don't know if they're in Alabama, and I don't know if they're in Belfast. But there's clearly a lot of people delighting in these events. And we understand from the PSNI that these things are organised through social media. There's a lot of disinformation out there. There's disinformation. There's videos going about that you would wonder why, because the real video is bad enough, frankly, and there's an awful lot of mistrust and even hatred of the media, and people saying things like, well, why aren't the media talking about this story? Well, we are. Here we are, and it's top of all of the local outlets here, top of our websites and on the front pages of our papers. But people are somehow convinced that they are fighting some sort of censorship, which is hiding the truth about migration from people, and it's really creating a febrile atmosphere.
Okay, well, Ciarán, thank you very much for chatting to us on Newscast when you've got so much of your own work to do. Good to catch up with you.
Thanks very much, Adam. Thank you very much, Chris.
Cheers.
And Chris, see you again soon.
Thanks a lot. Cheers, Adam.